So I now am sort of an expert on fire and flood. And this is not, I grew up in New Jersey, at the Jersey Shore. I was a beach girl. And in fact, today, in the summer months, I'll show up someplace in flip-flops, and people just kind of look incongruously at me in flip-flops out in the woods. And I'm like, but I'm a beach girl. I'm a Jersey girl. I wore flip-flops for 6 months out of the year. So I still go back to my roots. But growing up there, I grew up in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. And so some of you, if you're from the East Coast, you know that's where the boardwalk was. If you're not from the East Coast, watching Hurricane Sandy this fall, it directly slammed my home stomping grounds. I've been back several times since then. The home I grew up in is gone. But luckily, now, when my parents sold that about 15 years ago, it was on Barnegat Bay, and they sold the house. It was getting hard for them to deal with a 2-story house, so they wanted to move into a 1-story house, and they were selling that, and I was actually sort of snarky. I wasn't a very good daughter at that moment. I was like, I can't believe I'll have nothing to come home to. And my mom's like, really? Thought you were coming home for us. And I'm like, okay. I come home for you guys, but I won't be able to go sit on the dock and go swimming in the bay and all. But that's really, the bay is what led me to be an environmentalist. And growing up there, when I was a little kid, Barnegat Bay was a very clean water body. We could swim as long as the water was warm enough, it was safe to swim. We could go out and clam, and literally we would go into areas when the tide was low, and you'd see these little holes in the sand, and that's where the clams were. And we'd dig down with our toes, You'd do this, and you'd dig down till you grabbed the clam, lift it up in your toe. And the clams were, as I was a little child, they were very safe. And the crabs, we would go along and just scoop crabs off of pilings and poles and the bulkhead. And they were always safe to eat. But by the time I reached high school, so that area of New Jersey had stayed pretty undeveloped until the mid-'60s when the Garden State Parkway was completed. And at about that time, there were race riots in Newark that drove a lot of people out of North Jersey, and all of a sudden they had the parkway and could make it down to the shore easily in a day. They could commute every day. It was like if you had to drive from Colorado Springs to Denver in 1950, it was probably a heck of a lot slower drive than by the 1960s when the interstate was done. So all of a sudden, my bay, my stomping grounds, the place I spent all of my time as a child, became very dirty. And it was because of septic tanks. All of a sudden we had this massive spurt of development, and everybody had a septic tank. And this is sandy soil back there. And so all the septic tank, would end up in the bay. And all of a sudden it went from safe to swim, safe to fish, safe to eat those clams, till we suddenly had notices that it was not safe to swim, that you couldn't eat the clams, don't eat the fish in the bay. And so by the time I was in high school, I became a budding environmentalist. I suddenly started to go, what are we doing? We have to fix this problem. And so my first adult real-world job was to work in a sewer plant. This was 1974. One of our great environmental presidents, and I can't say anything else great about the man, but Richard Nixon was our great environmental president who signed many of our current environmental laws into being, including the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act paid to build all these sewer plants around the country, paid 75% grant back to the communities, and in poor communities up to a 95% grant to build a sewer plant. So my first real-world job as a practical, pragmatic type of enviro was to work in a sewer plant. It's like, okay, what I'm going to do to clean up the bay is to clean up the poop. And so that led me on this trail of becoming an enviro. And then I was 23 years old, and I was an avid skier. So I took a year-long trip living in my Toyota Corona, literally living in my Toyota Corona, and traveled around the U.S. and skied all over the U.S. And I fell in love with Colorado. So when my money was running out and it was time to like become an adult and get a job yet again, I got hired at the Breckenridge sewer plant. I think everybody here knows, if you didn't know where Point Pleasant is, you know where Breckenridge is, right? So I moved to the Breckenridge sewer plant and I became the turd queen of the county in Summit County. I met my husband there. So Ken is a multi-generational, and depending on if you count the great-grand-something that moved here or the grand-something that was born here, he's a fourth or a fifth generation Coloradan. His family moved and settled down in the La Junta area. Many of them are still down there. So once I married this native Coloradan, I became a default native Coloradan, but one that wears flip-flops a lot. So Ken and I, though, decided we really wanted to farm and we were into raising our own food, and we moved to Minnesota for 10 years and did an organic farm thing up there, milked cows, sold to Kraft. My favorite day of the week would be when the Kraft sales guy would come up with literally yesterday's caramels. And, if you've ever had a caramel in the grocery store, they're okay. If you have the caramel the day after it was made, they're like the most unbelievable thing you've ever had. But we did that for 10 years, and my native Coloradan needed to come home. We liked farming, and if we could have afforded a ranch here, we'd be ranching, but I tell people ranches are for Rockefellers or rock stars, and Celinda, someday I have to figure out which you guys are. So we came back, and just about when we came back, this new organization was forming, this Upper South Platte Watershed Group. And they were advertising for their very first employee, and I read the request for, putting in a proposal, and it literally read like my resume. So I'm like, well, bingo. So I applied, I get hired, and within the first week after I get the job, what I learned is that one of the things that caused people to come together and create this watershed group was the Buffalo Creek Fire. Anybody remember Buffalo Creek Fire? 1996, it was 11,700 acres. At that time, it was the largest fire in modern Colorado history. But for the good old days, right? The 11,700 acres, though, there's a lot of interesting stuff about Buffalo Creek. And one of the things about it is that those 11,700 acres burned in 4 hours. Literally a 4-hour fire. Blew up, ran, burned this landscape, and then turned back around on itself. And the firefighters were able to get it out. And the next day's weather was not cooperative. It wasn't good weather for burning. And so all was well, this was the fire. But what happened after the fire, and if you were around then and you followed the news and all, what happened in the next year and a half was 13 100-plus year flood events. Now, a 100-year flood event would traditionally be associated with a 100-year rain event. We're talking 100-year floods are not quite Noah and the Ark, but, this is something that does not happen frequently. If you look at the floodplain maps for the area, you see the 100-year floodplain that county governments and city governments analyze and say this is where floods will come with a 100-year storm. We don't expect them all the time. But we had in Buffalo Creek 13 of these storms. And one USGS estimates was actually it gets to the point that it's hard to even estimate what it was, but they say it was probably like a 2,000-year return interval flood. And that particular flood brought so much sediment down into the North Fork that it totally blocked the North Fork of the South Platte River and dammed the river up. Now, of course, Denver Water runs water from Lake Dillon, back there in Breckenridge, Summit County, runs water through the Roberts Tunnel, discharges that water into the North Fork. That water goes via the North Fork of the South Platte down to Strontia Springs Reservoir, just in the foothills, off where 470 kind of comes down and around in the southwest corner there. Just up in the foothills is this reservoir. That reservoir at the time was about a 10-year-old reservoir. So it was not long in existence. And when Denver built it, they estimated that it would take about 500 years for sediment to become problematic in the reservoir, for there to be enough sedimentation into it that they'd lose significant volume and have to deal with it. 500 years. In that summer, they filled it up. Literally, when that dam burst, so this huge tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of tons of sediment comes down, blocks the river. They're still running Roberts Tunnel because they don't know there's a dam. Nobody put that dam there on purpose. And suddenly that dam breaks, and all of that sediment goes downstream. 2 people died in the flood. And all of a sudden, well, Denver Water for sure suddenly woke up one day and went, oh, fire in our watershed is a problem. The Forest Service at the same time had a number of research scientists, and Denver has another reservoir in our watershed called Cheeseman. And at that time, there was a great research scientist who worked for the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. The station's up in Fort Collins, and Merrill Kaufman's his name. And Merrill was working there doing research on what the historic forests in the Front Range was. And the reason he could do that around Cheeseman was like a tree museum. Literally, in the 1860s, a precursor of Denver Water fenced it out to build this reservoir. And so it was never grazed. The trees were never cut. It was a tree museum. There were trees laying on the ground, dead, but that they could bore the trees, and you've seen people do tree rings, count the circles. Well, scientists put a bore in and take out a piece that's skinnier than a pencil, and they count the rings in that piece. There were trees on the ground that were dead, that were over 2,000 years old. And from that, they were able to create a history of tree density in our area, what the forest looked like pre-European Americans coming in. What was the trees like on Pikes Peak before we white people got here? And so they started to do this analysis, and Merrill said, boys and girls, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. The trees, we have way too many trees in the forest now. And why do we have too many trees? Because in 1910, the United States government, with the best of intentions, it was a bad fire year. People died in Idaho, people died in Montana, people died in Minnesota because of the bad fire year. The government said, we will put out every fire by 10 a.m. the next morning. So if a fire starts, we're going to get our hot shots, and we're going to get our guys who jump out of planes, and we're going to fight this fire, and we'll put it out by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I have to tell you, the Forest Service is amazing at putting out fires. And truly, you look at these fires now and you go, they're bad, and they are. But it's not because they're not really good at putting them out. It's because we now have unhealthy forests. And so being this pragmatic type of enviro who said, well, if my bay is dirty, the way to fix it is to work at a sewer plant, I said, well, how do we fix a forest now? Where we interrupted Mother Nature, Mother Earth's cleaning ability. And basically, fire was Mother Nature's cleaning system. And in these Front Range forests, these lower montane is what they're called forests, the density was, 60, 100 trees per acre at most. They were bigger trees, and they had fires every 30 to 50 years. And that fire would be, mainly it would burn along the ground, be fairly cool, burn all the little trees, burn the shrubs, burn the grasses. That would refresh the grasses. And the big old ponderosa pine, which is the dominant tree in our forests here. Now, when I came from the beach, it was a pine tree. Now I know it's a ponderosa pine. But those ponderosa pines, they're fire adapted. Our ecosystem's fire adapted, and they had a really thick bark. And so a big mature tree, these fires would come through, they'd burn off this lower layer, but it wouldn't kill the big trees. Rarely go up into the canopy, rarely kill those large trees. And you could go back through the trees at Cheeseman, and you could actually see those fires. We have a tree cookie at the CUSP office that's this big around, giant, from a Douglas fir that was at Cheeseman. And you can look in the tree rings and you can see those old fire scars within those trees, because the tree was big enough that it burned around the bottom, did some damage, but the tree survived, because that was part of Mother's system of dealing with forests. So with good intentions, it's that rule of unintended consequences, right? We intended good things, and I tell people, had I been here being an enviro, card carrying, proud of it, in 1910, if somebody had said, we're gonna put out all the fires, I would have probably been going, yeah, that's a good idea. Why do we don't want these trees to just be wasted in a fire, this is a resource. And we don't want the fire to kill Smokey the bear, We love Smokey. So and Bambi, we don't want the fire to kill Bambi. So let's put out the fires. But now we figured out, oh, darn, this was part of the natural system of maintaining these ecosystems. So now I tell people I am a tree hugger, and I'm very proud of that. But I'm also a tree hugger who hugs my chainsaw. And when Ken and I first moved to a new house near Cripple Creek, between Florissant and Cripple Creek, about 5 years ago now. We had been living out near Hartselle and 9 miles out gravel roads in Park County. We finally went okay, we got to be a little closer to civilization. But when we moved there, the first thing I did, because by then I've become a fire expert of sorts, the first thing we did was do defensible space and cut a bunch of trees that were right around the house. And literally the morning, because they were right around the house, we had to have a guy with a bucket come in and take them down, because it was like they were not safe. We had power lines, we had the house, we had the propane tank. The only way to take these trees down was from a bucket. But that morning before he cut those trees, I literally walk around and I hugged each of the 6 big ponderosa pines that had to come down. And I said, I'm really sorry you have to die today, through no fault of your own, but they had to die. And so now I look around these forests, and we have way too many trees. And that's why a Waldo fire became 18,700 acres. And that's why the Waldo fire did the kind of damage that it did. How am I doing time-wise, you guys? Am I good? 2 more minutes? So I do want to tell you a little bit in my last 2 minutes about, by the time Hayman was burning, and Richard mentioned that we've been dealing with Hayman for years, but by the time it was burning, I already thought of myself as kind of now a fire and forest expert. I'd been doing this work for about 6 years, and I went out at the day the fire reached a point that I could go into the fire without a red card. You know what a red card is? What the firefighters have that says they can hike straight up a hill with a backpack on, 45 miles, and, I have a crew of people who have their red cards. I could not pass that test now. But the first day I could go in without a red card, I went in with a couple of the Forest Service staff people. And we went up on the Matacat Road, which is the road between Cheeseman and Tarryall up in the upper South Platte. And we went in there, and I thought by this point in time, by 2002, I was pretty fire hardy, that I was tough into it, that I understood it, and I'd been on a number of other post-fire places already. But I went in there the first day and looked, and the Hayman was 137,000 acres. And that first day, I went up in that area on the Matacat, and it's one of those points where you can look around and you can see for miles and miles and miles. And all I saw was dead, burned trees, and I cried. I seriously just started bawling. But what I can tell you now is it's beautiful again. Elk, the biggest elk taken by a hunter in Colorado ever was taken out of the Hayman burn scar. There are turkeys back there now that weren't there. DOW has reintroduced bighorn sheep, whose habitat had been so encroached by too many trees. Now we have sheep habitat. So the thing is, we have a new kind of beauty after a fire, and we'll have a new beauty after the Waldo. I will take questions after, because I know people are interested in what's going on with the flooding, what are we learning, what are we doing, what's everybody doing. So that'll be it for my story, but I will answer your questions later.